Save my babies. A dying bobcat's final plea to the old man. She chose to trust. On an early winter morning, Dix Steele went up the mountain to gather firewood as usual. The cold air bit at his cheeks, sharp and clean, reminding him he was still alive, still capable of simple tasks. But halfway up the slope, the world tilted. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like ink spreading through water. He stumbled, his knees buckling, and suddenly he was falling, the white snow rushing up to meet him. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't remember where he was. The trees looked unfamiliar, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward a gray sky. How long had he been walking? Which direction was home? His heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. This was what he feared most, this moment when his mind betrayed him, when the world became a stranger. He staggered down the mountain, following what he hoped was the right path. Then he saw them, bobcat tracks stamped into the snow, the prints small and purposeful, and beside them, long smears of blood, dark against the white, leading toward his cabin. His breath caught in his throat. Something was hurt. Something was dying. Near his door, he stopped. The air felt different, charged with a presence he couldn't name. From the brush at the edge of the clearing, a bobcat emerged. She was larger than any bobcat he'd ever seen, her tufted ears pointing skyward, her eyes amber and ancient. In her mouth, she carried a cub, its pale fur matted and dirty, its body so thin he could see the outline of its ribs. She placed the cub at his feet with a gentleness that made his throat tighten. Then she looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him, directly into his eyes. And in that moment, a question formed in his mind, clear as if someone had spoken aloud. Why me? The bobcat turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving only tracks in the snow and the tiny, shivering cub at his feet. Dix knelt slowly, his joints protesting, and gathered the cub into his hands. It was barely alive, its breathing shallow, its heart a faint flutter against his palm. He carried it inside and set it near the fireplace, wrapping it in an old flannel shirt that had belonged to Laurel, his wife, dead 3 years now. Though some mornings he still woke up expecting to find her beside him, still caught himself setting 2 cups out for morning coffee. That was when he'd moved here, to this cabin by the forest. After Laurel died and the fear set in, the terrible knowledge that his mind was slipping away. He'd noticed it first in small things, forgetting where he'd put his keys, losing track of conversations mid-sentence, calling David by his father's name. His son had been patient, kind even, but Dix saw the worry in his eyes, the careful way David watched him, as if he might break. So he'd left, told David he wanted solitude, wanted to spend his remaining years in peace. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He couldn't bear to become a burden, couldn't stand the thought of David's life shrinking to accommodate his failing father. The doctor's appointments and the medications in the slow, inevitable decline. Better to disappear quietly, to let David remember him as he'd been, not as he was becoming. The cubs survived the night, and the next. Dix fed it milk from an eyedropper, watched it grow stronger day by day. He named it Frosty, for its cream-colored fur. Pale as early snow, caring for Frosty gave shape to his days, anchored him when his mind tried to drift. The cub knocked on his bedroom door every morning at 6, its small paw insistent against the wood. It scratched gently at the chair leg whenever Dix sat down to read, a reminder of its presence. At night, it curled in exactly the same spot beside the fireplace, its body a warm, breathing comma. Dix began to call it his living clock. Those predictable behaviors, those small rituals, helped him mark the passage of time when his memory couldn't. He knew it was morning when Frosty knocked. He knew it was evening when the bobcat settled by the fire. The world made sense again, in these small, contained ways. One afternoon, while cleaning the woodshed, Dix found evidence of surveillance, food containers overturned, their contents spilled, animal fur caught on the window frame, gray and soft, footprints circling the house, the same pattern repeated over many days. The bobcat had been watching him, studying him. She hadn't simply abandoned her cub in desperation. She had chosen him deliberately. He collapsed to his knees in the shed, his hands trembling as he stroked the tuft of fur left on the window. A sob burst from his throat, raw and wordless. Even he could not believe it. That someone, even a wild creature who could not speak, had looked at him and decided he was trustworthy, had seen him living quietly, posing no threat, and thought, this one, this human can care for what I love most. He wept then, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since Laurel died, because he'd been so certain he was invisible, irrelevant, a man whose time had passed. But the bobcat had seen him, had judged him worthy. It shouldn't have mattered so much. The opinion of a wild animal, but it did. God help him. It did. Frosty grew quickly, its body filling out, its movements becoming fluid and confident. Dix taught it to come when called, to stay off the kitchen counter. Small things that made cohabitation easier, but he never tried to make it into something it wasn't. Frosty was wild, would always be wild, and that was as it should be. The first time Frosty brought him a bird, Dix froze. It was early spring, the morning light streaming through the windows, and the bobcat pushed through the cat door he'd installed, something gray and limp dangling from its jaws. A junco, its neck broken cleanly, its wings spread at awkward angles. Death, the sight hit him like a fist to the stomach. All he could see was Laurel in her hospital bed, her body broken by cancer, her breath rattling in her lungs. All he could feel was the helplessness, the rage at his own uselessness. He stumbled backward, his voice sharp. No, take it outside, take it away. But Frosty didn't move. It lowered its head and placed the bird carefully at Dix's feet. Then it stepped back and sat, its golden eyes fixed on his face, waiting, its tail curled around its paws, its ears swiveled forward, alert and hopeful. Dix's anger drained away, replaced by something more complex. This wasn't cruelty. This wasn't death for death's sake. This was a gift. Frosty had hunted successfully, had proven its skill, and it wanted to share that success with him. I can take care of you too. That's what those steady eyes were saying. I can provide. I am strong enough to help. He knelt slowly and picked up the bird. Its body was still warm, its feathers soft. This was what Frosty was, what it would always be, a predator, a creature of tooth and claw, of blood and survival. And loving Frosty meant accepting that, not trying to sand away the sharp edges to make it more palatable, more pet-like, more human. He looked at the bobcat, really looked at it, and saw not the cub he'd saved, but a living being trying to connect through the only language it knew. Its wild instincts weren't something to be ashamed of or frightened by. They were part of the truth of what it was. And if he loved Frosty, he had to love all of it, not just the parts that were easy. Thank you, he said quietly. This is a good gift. Frosty's tail flickered once, satisfaction clear in every line of its body. It came forward and rubbed against his legs, purring, a sound like distant thunder. Over the following weeks, Frosty continued to hunt. It brought mice, sometimes rabbits, once even a squirrel. Dix learned to accept these offerings with grace, to thank the bobcat sincerely, to dispose of the prey respectfully. He understood now what he was witnessing. Frosty was maturing, growing into its full self, and that self was magnificent and fierce and entirely other. His job wasn't to tame that wildness, but to honor it, to create space where wild and domestic could coexist without either one being diminished. At night, he read to Frosty from the same books he'd once read to David, Charlotte's Web, with its meditation on death and friendship, The Velveteen Rabbit, with its insistence that love makes things real. Frosty would settle beside him on the couch, its head resting on his thigh, and sometimes it fell asleep before the story ended, its breathing deep and even. On those nights, Dix would stroke its fur and whisper, my son used to do the same, fall asleep right at the good parts. The loneliness was less sharp with Frosty in the house, but it was still there, a low hum beneath everything. He missed David with an ache that never quite went away, missed the sound of another human voice, the give and take of conversation. But he didn't call, didn't reach out. What would he say? That some days he couldn't remember what year it was, that he'd put the coffee pot in the freezer and spent 20 minutes searching for it, that he was terrified of the blank spaces in his mind, the way whole hours would simply vanish instead. He created exercises for Frosty, games that would prepare it for eventual release. He placed food on high shelves, making the bobcat climb. He hid toys throughout the cabin, encouraging it to search and stalk. He opened windows and let it watch birds, sharpening its hunting instincts. He told himself it was for Frosty's own good. This training, but really, he was preparing himself, teaching himself how to let go. Then he noticed something strange. Frosty, which had been growing increasingly agile and clever, suddenly seemed clumsy. It knocked things over. It failed to catch toys it had caught easily before. It appeared confused by simple tasks, sitting and staring as if it had forgotten what it was supposed to do. Dix's heart sank. Was something wrong with it? Some illness, some injury he'd missed. He watched the bobcat anxiously, trying to determine what had changed. And it was only later, much later, that he understood what he was actually seeing. 6 years passed. Dix was 74 now, his body wearing down in ways he couldn't ignore. His knees ached constantly. His hands shook when he tried to write. And his memory, his traitorous memory, continued its slow dissolution. Some mornings he woke and didn't know where he was. He'd created a notebook, writing down everything he wanted to remember. How Laurel liked her ginger tea, 3 minutes of steeping, a twist of lemon, how David used to wheeze when he slept, a soft whistle on every exhale, how Frosty loved being scratched behind the ears, its eyes closing in bliss. The notebook was titled Things I Don't Want to Forget. It was his mind, externalized, a copy he could leave behind when the original finally crashed. Then, one winter evening, the bobcat returned. Dix heard Frosty's warning cry and went to the door, his heart pounding. There she was, Shadow. That's what he'd named her in his mind. But she looked terrible. Blood matted the fur on her shoulder. She limped badly, favoring her left foreleg, and behind her, 3 small shapes huddled in the snow, cubs. Shadow looked at him with those same amber eyes, and he heard the question again, just as clear as the first time. Will you? He wanted to say no. He was too old, too tired, too broken. He'd barely managed with Frosty, and that was 6 years ago when he was younger and stronger. How could he possibly care for 3 cubs? What if he forgot to feed them? What if he had one of his bad days and left the door open and they escaped? What if? He started to close the door. I'm sorry, he said. I can't. Frosty came to stand beside him. It didn't meow, didn't make a sound. It simply sat and looked at him, its golden eyes reflecting the firelight from inside the cabin. And in that gaze, Dix saw himself in Laurel, saw the way she'd looked at him in the hospital, trusting him to make the hard decisions, saw the way David had looked at him before he left for the cabin, hurt and confused but trying to respect his father's choices. He opened the door. Shadow didn't come inside. She simply pushed the cubs forward, nudging them with her nose. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Dix knew, somehow, that he wouldn't see her again, that she'd used the last of her strength to bring her children to safety. The 3 cubs huddled on the porch, shivering. Frosty went to them immediately, sniffing each one, its body language protective. Dix gathered them up, marveling at how tiny they were, how fragile. One was bright-eyed and active, already trying to squirm free of his grasp. Flint, he named it, for its steely determination. One was small, with weak hind legs that dragged slightly. Thimble, because it was so delicate. And one was quiet, watchful, its eyes taking in everything. Wisp, like smoke, like something you couldn't quite hold. Over the next week, he searched for Shadow, found her body beneath a large pine tree at the edge of his property, frozen in the snow. He buried her there, digging through the frozen ground until his hands bled. Frosty lay beside the grave for an entire day, not eating, barely moving. The 3 cubs pressed against the older bobcat, seeking comfort. Dix began a new chapter. 4 bobcats now, instead of 1. The work was exhausting. Bottles every few hours, cleaning, monitoring their health, making sure they were warm and safe. There were days when he could barely get out of bed, when his body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But the cubs needed him, and somehow, that made all the difference. Flint slept on the doorstep like a guardian, alert to every sound. Wisp claimed the windowsill, watching the forest with unblinking focus. And Thimble, with its weak legs, slept beside Dix's feet at night, its small body warm against his ankles. Frosty moved between them all, grooming them, teaching them, a parent in everything but blood. One night, Dix made himself dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread. He set it on the table and turned to get a glass of water. When he came back, Frosty was sitting beside his bowl, staring at it, but not eating. Dix watched, confused. The bobcat had its own food, had eaten earlier. Why was it fixated on his dinner? Then he understood. Frosty wouldn't eat unless he ate, was making sure he took care of himself. The realization made his eyes sting. From that night on, he wrote in his calendar at the beginning of each day, "Eat for me and for him." The cubs grew. Flint became bold and adventurous, always the first to explore new territory. Wisp became thoughtful and cautious, assessing every situation before acting. And Thimble, despite its disability, became determined and clever, finding ways to accomplish what its body made difficult. Dix watched Frosty with them and finally understood what he'd seen months ago, that sudden clumsiness, that apparent loss of intelligence. Frosty had been pretending, had been deliberately acting helpless so that Dix would feel needed, would feel necessary. Because if Frosty could do everything on its own, if it was completely self-sufficient, then Dix might think his job was finished, might think it was time to let go of the bobcat, of life, of everything. Frosty hadn't wanted him to prepare for goodbye, had wanted him to keep living, keep trying, keep holding on. The manipulation was so human, so achingly familiar, that Dix had to sit down, had to press his hands to his face and breathe through the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This creature loved him enough to pretend weakness, loved him enough to lie. He called Frosty over and held its face between his hands. "I see you," he said. "I see what you did, and I love you too." The bobcat purred, the sound rumbling through both their bodies. Then, one morning in late spring, David's truck pulled up the dirt road to the cabin. Dix heard it from inside and went to the window, his heart hammering. He hadn't seen his son in years, had told himself it was better this way, cleaner. But now, watching David climb out of the truck, older and grayer than Dix remembered, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. David knocked on the door. Dix opened it slowly, bracing himself for anger, for recrimination. But David just smiled, tired and sad, and said, "Hi, Dad." The bobcats emerged from various corners of the cabin, curious about the stranger. David's eyes widened as he took them in. 4 of them were watching him with alert interest. "How long have you been running a wildlife sanctuary?" he asked. "It's a long story," Dix said. They sat on the porch, and Dix told him everything. About Frosty, about Shadow, about the 3 cubs. David listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Dix finished, David was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you call me?" he finally asked. "I would have helped. I would have been here." "You have your own life," Dix said, "your own family." "I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden," David repeated. "Dad, do you know how many times I've driven out here, parked down the road, just to make sure you were okay? Do you know how many nights I've stayed awake, wondering if you'd fallen, if you were hurt, if you needed help?" Dix felt something crack inside his chest. "I didn't know. You left because you thought the world had moved on without you," David said. "Because everything's different now, all the technology, the way people talk, the speed of everything. You thought you didn't fit anymore. But Dad, the world doesn't abandon people. You assumed you were left behind, but you weren't. I never left. Mom wouldn't have left. You just stopped letting us find you." Dix looked out at the forest, at the mountains beyond, for years. He'd been so certain that his time had passed, that he was obsolete. But maybe David was right. Maybe he'd simply chosen to be invisible. Maybe the world had been there all along, ready to welcome him, and he just refused to see it. David stayed, not just for a day or a weekend, but permanently. He moved into the cabin, setting up a bed in the small second room. Together, they cared for the four bobcats. David was amazed by Frosty, by the way it followed Dix from room to room, the way it seemed to anticipate his needs. One evening, David watched Frosty tap its claws on the floor. 3 deliberate beats, a rhythm that tugged at his memory. Mom used to do that, he said quietly, when she was worried. 3 taps on the table. How does Frosty know Dix had wondered the same thing? Maybe Shadow had learned it from watching Laurel through the windows all those years ago. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe, just maybe, there were connections between living things that couldn't be explained. Threads of understanding that transcended species and even death. Mom sent Frosty to me, Dix said. I'm sure of it. David reached out and scratched Frosty behind the ears. Thanks, Mom, he whispered. As spring turned to summer, Flint, Wisp, and Thimble grew stronger and more independent. They spent longer periods outside, ranging farther from the cabin. Dix knew what was coming. They were meant to be wild. And wild things don't stay in houses forever. Even Thimble, with its weak legs, had learned to climb and hunt, adapting to its limitations with remarkable creativity. One day in late August, they didn't come back. Dix and David searched the forest, calling their names, but found nothing. It's time, David said gently. They're ready. Dix nodded, unable to speak. He'd known this would happen, had prepared for it, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. Frosty stood at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the forest. It was 8 years old now, still strong and healthy, still capable of surviving on its own. Dix saw the longing in the bobcat's eyes, the pull of the wild. Go, he said. It's okay. You can go. But Frosty turned away from the forest and came back to him. It rubbed against his legs, purring, then walked to the cabin door and waited. Dix understood. Frosty had made its choice. It would stay, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. They fell into new routines, the 3 of them. David took over many of the physical tasks that Dix could no longer manage, but Frosty remained Dix's companion, sleeping beside his bed, following him through his daily activities. On days when Dix's memory was particularly bad, when he forgot where he was or what year it was, Frosty would press against him, a warm, solid presence that anchored him to reality. David worked from the cabin, his laptop connecting him to a world Dix barely understood. But in the evenings, they talked. David told him about his work, about his daughter, Dix's granddaughter, who was studying biology in college. He showed Dix pictures on his phone, videos that moved and spoke. The technology was baffling, but the content was familiar. Family, connection, love. Sometimes David's colleagues would call, their voices coming through the computer speakers, their faces appearing on the screen. Dix listened from his chair by the fire, marveling at how the world had changed. People in different cities, different countries, working together as if they were in the same room. It was overwhelming, this new world. But it was also beautiful. In its way, the speed, the connectivity, the endless flow of information. It wasn't his world, not really, but that didn't mean it was wrong. One morning, for 3 weeks straight, David and Frosty guided Dix down to the small stream behind the cabin. His legs were weak, his balance uncertain, but they supported him on either side, patient and steady. The first time they reached the stream, Dix stood on the bank and breathed in the smell of damp earth and moss. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the water. He'd forgotten this existed. This simple beauty had been so consumed by his fear and shame that he'd stopped noticing the world around him. Thank you, he said to both of them, for reminding me. Winter came again. Dix was 95 years old now, a fact that surprised him every time he remembered it. How had he lived so long? How was he still here? His body was failing in earnest now. His hands shook constantly. His vision was blurred. His memory was more holes than substance. But he was still here, still breathing, still capable of joy. One night, sitting by the fire with Frosty beside him, He said quietly, "No one knows I ever existed, except you." Behind him, David's voice came from the doorway. And me, and Mom, and those bobcats. "Dad, you're not invisible. You never were." Dix turned, tears streaming down his face. David came and sat beside him, putting an arm around his shoulders. Frosty climbed into his lap, something it rarely did anymore, and began to purr. On his 95th birthday, David prepared a small celebration. A cake, though Dix couldn't eat more than a bite. Candles that made his eyes water. And at the table, an extra plate and chair for Frosty. Because the bobcat was family, just as much as any of them. Dix tried to use his fork, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. The silverware clattered to the floor again and again. He sighed in frustration, embarrassment heating his face. David laughed, not unkindly. "Now I have something to do for you," he said, picking up a fork and cutting a piece of cake. "Open up." Frosty licked Dix's hands, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Dix relaxed, letting David feed him, letting himself be cared for. It wasn't shameful, he realized. It was just love, offered and received. A movement outside the window caught his attention. Frosty leapt to the porch, its body tense and alert. David stood and looked out. Three shapes stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the house. Flint, broader and more scarred than before. Wisp, sleek and beautiful. And Thimble, still smaller than the others but strong and healthy. They'd come back, not to say but to visit, to check on the strange human who'd cared for them when they were small and helpless. Dix's throat tightened. They remembered. After all this time, they remembered. David brought Dix's wheelchair to the door. "Let's go see them," he said. They went into the forest, David pushing the wheelchair over the rough ground, Frosty leading the way. Flint, Wisp, and Thimble kept their distance but didn't flee. They watched as David stopped the wheelchair in a small clearing, surrounded by trees. Frosty went to the other three bobcats, touching noses with each of them in turn. A reunion, a recognition of bonds that couldn't be broken. David had been 7 years old when he first asked his father what happened when people died. They'd been sitting in the backyard, watching fireflies blink in the summer darkness. And Laurel had just gone inside to answer the phone. Dix had frozen, unprepared for such weight from such a small voice. He'd fumbled through an answer about heaven and memory, about how people lived on in the hearts of those who loved them. David had considered this seriously. His face scrunched in concentration, then said, "So if I remember you every single day, you'll never really be gone." "Yes," Dix had said, "exactly that." Now, decades later, David understood what his father had been too proud to ask for: to be remembered, to matter, to leave some mark on the world that proved he had existed at all. One afternoon, while Dix napped by the fire, David went through the notebook titled "Things I Don't Want to Forget," page after page of his father's shaking handwriting, growing less legible as the years progressed. But there, near the middle, David found an entry that made his breath catch. David's first word was not mama or dada, but bird, because we lived near the park and he loved watching them. He could sit for hours, perfectly still, just watching. I told Laurel he'd be a scientist or a philosopher, someone who notices things other people miss. David closed the notebook carefully, his vision blurring. His father had been right. He'd become a researcher, studying migration patterns, spending his life watching birds move across continents. He'd never made the connection before, never traced that career back to those hours in the park and with his father's patient presence beside him. That evening, David told Dix about his work, really told him. Not just the simple version he usually offered. He explained his research, the patterns he'd discovered, the papers he'd published. Dix listened with fierce attention, asking questions that revealed he understood far more than David had given him credit for. When had he started assuming his father couldn't follow complex ideas? When had he begun speaking to him like a child? "I'm sorry," David said suddenly, "for treating you like you were already gone, for forgetting that you are still here, still you, even when your memory fails." Dix reached out with a trembling hand and gripped David's wrist. "You came back," he said. "That's what matters. You came back." They developed new rituals. Every Morning, David made coffee the way Laurel used to, strong and black with a touch of cinnamon. They drank it on the porch while Frosty patrolled the perimeter of the clearing. David would read the news aloud, translating the complicated modern world into terms his father could grasp. In return, Dix told stories from his own youth, from the years before David was born, when he and Laurel were young and fearless and certain they could build a life from nothing but love and determination. Some days, Dix forgot who David was, called him by his own father's name, or by the name of a childhood friend long dead. On those days, David didn't correct him. He simply sat with his father, holding his hand, being whoever Dix needed him to be in that moment. Because love wasn't about being remembered correctly. It was about showing up again and again, regardless of whether your presence was understood or recognized. One night, Frosty brought them both a gift, a rabbit laid carefully at their feet. The bobcat looked from Dix to David and back again, its meaning clear. You are both my family. I provide for you both. David met his father's eyes across the body of the rabbit, and something unspoken passed between them. Acceptance, gratitude, the understanding that they'd been given something rare and precious. This strange household of humans and wild things, this unexpected grace. We're lucky, David said. Dix nodded, stroking Frosty's head. So lucky we almost missed it. Dix looked around at the forest, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the wild creatures who'd chosen to trust him. David stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow. If one day every memory leaves me, Dix said quietly, may the forest wind remind me that I was once loved this much. David squeezed his shoulder. You are loved this much, Dad. Present tense, now and always. Frosty returned and placed its head on Dix's lap, its golden eyes reflecting the dying light. The other three bobcats moved closer, forming a loose circle around them. For a moment, everything was perfect and whole. Man and wild creature, father and son, memory and presence, all existing together in a single, shimmering instant. Dix closed his eyes and let himself feel it, let himself believe it. He was not invisible. He was not forgotten. He was here, still here, witnessed and loved by the world he'd thought had left him behind. The forest wind moved through the trees, carrying his name. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.